Thank you so much. One thing that wasn't mentioned is I'm actually originally from Minneapolis. I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. My parents are from Northeast. Grandparents were raised here. My sister and mom still live here in Minnesota in Duluth. So it's great, with great fondness that I return to the Twin Cities and speak about a state that I care a lot about. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in my remarks. It's meant to hopefully kind of chart a course where we can improve the state going forward. So I thought I'd begin my remarks with kind of putting in perspective where Minnesota stands today in terms of the standard measures of economic performance that economists look at whenever we compare countries to each other or states to each other. These are the things that we normally look at in order to rank states or countries in terms of their economic performance today. So if we look at the big four, starting with growth and personal income, we can see over the last 3 years, Minnesota has ranked 33rd in personal income growth. Next, private sector employment growth, 0% increase over the last 3 years, a rank of 33rd. If you include public sector employment growth, the rank is 39th. So you've actually, I think it shows that you've held public sector employment growth in check over the last 3 years more than other states, which I think probably most people in this room would consider a good thing. Looking next at the other factor that most economists look at is migration rates. So we looked at domestic in-migration into the state, negative 0.1%, not good, you're bleeding people. Probably a lot of the best and brightest people, unfortunately, are leaving the state, and that's another kind of cautionary indicator that's important to look at. And third is the other factor most economists would look at is net business formation. How many new businesses are being started in the state, and how many businesses are dying in the state over time. And you can see that's actually your best ranking, 19th, a plus 1.2% over the last 3 years that data was collected. So overall, if you look at these numbers, the consensus is a fourth quintile ranking of around 30. So nothing to write home about, definitely could be improved upon. And I think, the message is, and I'm kind of highlighting some of the takeaway messages in red here, is that, every Minnesotan must become aware of these numbers if people are going to care to make changes. And I think that's why it's so important to support groups like the Minnesota Free Market Institute, because they're very focused on getting this message out and educating the public in terms of where Minnesota stands. I don't think people will care about making changes until they understand there's a problem. And one of the main focuses of this think tank is to make sure everybody understands that there is a problem. You don't want to be 30th, you can do better than 30th, and I think that's a major message that this think tank going forward can get the message out. Now, in terms of what policies are contributing to this 30th place ranking, I looked at next kind of broad bird's eye view of where Minnesota stands in terms of all of these various policies that the state can. Basically, the best way to think about it is these are dials that the state can turn in order to change those big four performance rankings. And again, people are unlikely to care about making policy changes if they don't understand the connection between how policy changes can lead to better outcomes in terms of income growth, population growth, new business formation, that sort of thing. Another reason to support the Minnesota Free Market Institute is because they can make the connection between the policies and the outcomes, which is another important factor, another important link to the whole policy reform change. So let's look at where the Minnesota ranks in terms of these various kind of bird's eye looking at public policy. As she mentioned, my index that I produce, I have a copy here somewhere. It's the U.S. Economic Freedom Index. We do this every 4 years. And the first one was 1999. Minnesota was ranked 43rd. Then in 2004, you moved down a spot to 44th. And as she mentioned, a big jump between 2004 and 2008. And we'll talk about a little bit more about why that was or is. But 26th. There's another ranking, the ALEC, Art Laffer. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's kind of a conservative coalition of state legislators. And Art Laffer, of course, is the father of supply-side economics. And they now produce this annual study called Rich States, Poor States that ranks the states. And as you can see, the last one 2 years ago, Minnesota's 39th, now it's 40th, so it's kind of stayed around where it was, hasn't moved any. The Mercatus, or Fraser Institute, the Economic Freedom of North America, as you can see, this is an annual 35th, 37th, 32nd, so it's moved up a little bit. The states improved a little bit in terms of the economic policies. But again, kind of right around the fourth quintile. Mercatus, again, this is a new index. First year, just came out this year, freedom in the 50 states. It looks at both economic freedom, which is, tax, fiscal, regulatory policy, and also personal freedom. So freedom like laws on marijuana use, laws on prostitution, that sort of thing. So that they look at other areas that I don't look at in my index. But again, Minnesota 31st. So you're kind of stuck right around the 30th. You're kind of getting to see the pattern here. Another one is the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council Small Business Survival Index. And you do really poorly in this one, and have for years. Before that, 46, you were 47th. So you've been in the bottom 10 every single time on that one. So again, the consensus is about 35th in terms of your state fiscal regulatory policies, which is contributing to your 30th ranking overall in terms of performance. The one bright spot, though, is Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, does an annual assessment of the governors. And your governor, Tim Pawlenty, comes out very strongly in this consistently. 2004, he got a grade of B. They grade from A to F. C dipped down a little bit 2006, but again back up to B, 12th place. So he was ranked 12th best of every governor in the country in 2008. So I think that's one of your bright spots and probably one of the reasons why you have moved up to where you're at today. Now, in terms of drilling down a little bit further into areas where Minnesota is competitive and uncompetitive in these areas, which are kind of the standard areas that economists would look at in terms of public policy, state borrowing, taxes, spending, regulations, and the legal climate. I looked at your borrowing, and your rank is kind of in the middle. One thing I think that's interesting, though, is your debt service as a share of tax revenue is 7.6%. So this looks at, how does Minnesota get its money? I mean, it can either get money through borrowing or you can get money through taxing in order to spend. And your borrowing, burdens are roughly around average. Although 7.6% of your tax revenue is spent on servicing your debt, which is a little high. You want to keep that more around 4, 5, 6 at most. So that's actually a lot of money that's going to service debt compared to other states. But the interesting thing, though, is your state debt level per capita is rather low. It's down in the 40s. What brings this up is your local debt. You have a lot of local debt in Minnesota, which is driving this ranking way down from the 40s that it is at the state level to overall 21. So I created this red flag here would be, local debt is definitely an area that you'd want to watch to try to contain. There's various rules that states use or local areas use to contain local debt, which is, make sure voters vote on every bond that's issued by the local community. I don't know if that's done here in Minnesota. That's the law in California, which has really kept local debt burdens much lower in California than they would otherwise be. But that's one area I think that would really watch in the future. Now, in terms of Minnesota taxes, it is truly as bad as your reputation has around the country. Minnesota's state and local tax burden has consistently been among the highest. You're 12th highest nationally overall. This is state and local. Among states levying personal income taxes, Minnesota's top marginal rate ranks 9th highest, and it's 6th highest personal income tax burden per capita. I did an estimation. I think you get roughly about 41% of your total tax revenue from, according to the websites that I was looking at, from personal income taxes. But this is the next one. Well, you're 41st in Tax Foundation State Business Tax Climate, which looks at all business taxes across the states. And again, that's probably one reason why your ranking in terms of the small business climate, that was 46 that I showed earlier, is so so low is because your business taxes are just so bad, including this one in particular. Among states levying corporate income taxes, Minnesota's flat rate of 9.8% ranks third highest nationally. It's actually higher than what we have in California. We have a flat tax of, I think it's 8.84%. So your rate's actually higher than California's. But you only generate, according to my figures that I found, 5% of your tax revenue from the corporate taxes, yet you have, what, the third highest tax rate in the country. So it's a crushing tax burden to place on corporations to just generate 5% of your revenue. It makes no sense economically to do it this way. So, and also your property taxes, 27th highest, sales tax burden, 22nd highest. So, overall, ironically, tomorrow is your Minnesota's Tax Freedom Day as well as Tax Day. But that's Tax Freedom Day, if you don't know, that's the day of the year where you've worked from January 1st up to your Tax Freedom Day to pay your federal, state, and local tax bill for the year. So your day, you've actually worked from January 1st to tomorrow to pay all of your taxes for the year. So really, your crushing tax code in this state is really hurting the state competitively, and particularly the corporate income tax. And I know there's a commission that's been appointed to look at this, and they have a report that's, I guess it's to eliminate the corporate sales or corporate income tax and replace it with more of a broad-based sales tax. I think that would be an excellent thing to do because this is really harming the state. Now, look, in terms of spending, I think this is, these two slides show that, you can eliminate your taxes at the corporate level, still bring in more revenue. This is historical data on tax rates and revenues, for example, during the 1920s. The dashed line is the tax rate. This is at the federal level. As you can see, as the rate went down by 1925, you were actually then generating more revenue over time. This is the classic Laffer curve, supply-side economics, that you can drop the tax rates and actually bring in more revenue. Worked in the 1920s. Again, it worked in the 1980s. You can see the same effect going on. It would work again today. It would work in Minnesota. And so I don't think you need to fear that if you eliminate the corporate income tax, you're not going to bring in as much revenue. I think it would be just the opposite. And, historical data shows it. Now, in terms of spending, total spending, a lot of the facts come from this report that just came out that I did. There we go, Minnesota spending. Again, your state spending per capita is 36. Again, you're in the 30s. Government size in terms of agencies and bureaucrats, that's one of the numbers that we crunch in here, 33rd. As you can see, you were 39th and you went to 27th. Now you're 33rd. So you were kind of heading in the right direction, but then you reversed it. That looks at total number of bureaucrats, agencies, the amount of red tape you have to go through to get something done. Welfare spending has improved in terms of the amount of the percentage of the budget that's devoted to welfare spending. So I think that's one of the major reasons why you've moved up from 44th to 26th is this greater spending restraint during the Palante governorship years. Fiscal policy overall, you can see, was 48th and 46th, now 38th, so moving in the right direction. The Mercatus study backs up what we found because it has you roughly at the same amount, ranking 35th. So, overall, I think the message is on spending that you're moving in the right direction. You've had more spending restraint in recent years, particularly in welfare spending, which, a lot of people would argue that you're going to attract the wrong people through greater welfare payouts versus other states. So, but you're still kind of stuck in the fourth quintile again in that area. Now, in terms of regulations, just briefly, again, ranked 36th, you were headed in the right direction again, but kind of fell back into your fourth quintile habits. Again, according to that, I should make this clear that you can do nothing and still fall in the rankings that I produce because it's an ordinal ranking. So you can do absolutely nothing harmful but still move back because other states are leapfrogging you and doing things well. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of the legal climate, I also produce this study every year, or every 2 years actually, the U.S. Tort Liability Index, which measures this and compares the states based on the legal climate in their state. Basically, how fair and balanced and how costly and risky is the legal climate within each state. So this study looks at the rule of law and property rights within each state. Now, Minnesota, as of the most recent year, 2006, has annual tort costs of about $2.5 billion, so it's ranked roughly in the middle. In terms of, and tort costs are, how much people are paying to compensate individuals for injuries from using products. So if you use a toaster and it blows up in your face and you get hurt, that's a tort that's been committed on you. You've been harmed, so you get compensation for that. And the total bill was $2.5 billion in terms of direct tort costs for Minnesota. If you then adjust it for the size of the state in terms of the population and the level of economic activity, you rank 27th. So you actually have disproportionately high tort costs in Minnesota given the size of your state in terms of population and economic activity. So that's one thing that you should keep an eye on too, is your legal system. Overall, if you include both costs and risks, so risk would be your probability of being sued in the state, like how many lawyers are practicing in the state per capita, how many what's called judicial hellholes you have in your state. The American Tort Reform Association every year comes out with a ranking of what they call judicial hellholes, which are like magnets for tort lawsuits to be filed, some of the most crazy lawsuits you can ever imagine. So if you include both costs and risks, Minnesota ranks 21st. And so that's not too bad. It's just a little bit above average. But the problem is that you haven't done anything in terms of comprehensive tort reform to keep those costs low going forward. So one of the reasons maybe why you have low costs is because you don't have a whole lot of deep pockets here in the state to go after in terms of, because all the corporations are leaving. So it might be kind of deceptive. You have low tort costs because you don't have a whole lot of deep pockets to sue because a lot of businesses are just cutting out. So the next slide looks at tort reform, and Colorado, Texas, Ohio, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi have been really big on tort reform the last 3-4 years. New York, Maryland, Vermont, Rhode Island have done absolutely nothing. Minnesota, very poor in terms of tort reform, ranked 41st. So even though your costs and risks are low at 21, I don't think you can necessarily take a lot of satisfaction that it's going to stay that way, because lawsuit abuse really is kind of a game of whack-a-mole. The attorney, the game you used to play at the fair where you hit the ball and it pops up somewhere else? It's kind of like that. I mean, the plaintiff's bar is constantly looking for the next greener pasture. And if Minnesota doesn't do anything to kind of head them off at the pass, Minnesota could be the next hotbed for whatever kind of lawsuit. I mean, now Delaware is a hotbed for asbestos and silica lawsuits. And you don't think of really as being an industrial site or industrial state for that kind of lawsuit, but it's because they haven't done anything in terms of tort reform to rein that in. So, whereas a lot of states have passed major asbestos tort reform. So I think that's another cautionary tale, is that you need to kind of look at your legal climate here going forward and see if more can be done. Now we looked at kind of the red flags, which this is summarized: growing local debt burdens, I think crushing uncompetitive tax code, especially for corporations and small business, spending moving in the right direction, but still more could be done. We have regulatory state, again, I think growing once again, but minorly. I mean, I wouldn't see that as a huge problem. And few tort reforms to limit lawsuit abuse. The other thing that you don't have is like tax and expenditure limits that other states have. So, I mean, these are the areas I think that are important to watch going forward and to do something about. So what's kind of the best strategy? And my question here is, you have to get Minnesotans willing to tackle these policy issues and policy weaknesses. I mean, you can list them and you can explain where Minnesota ranks compared to other states. It's not doing well, but you really need to get people focused on it, energized, excited, and to see the problem for what it is. And oftentimes, unfortunately, it often takes a crisis. I mean, in California, for example, she mentioned the workers' comp reform work that I've done out there. I mean, it literally had to come to a point where businesses were closing, businesses were fleeing to Nevada, Arizona, Utah, just because of this one thing, which basically brought Schwarzenegger to office. It was Gray Davis's inability to handle the workers' comp problem and also the electricity problem that really kind of championed Arnold up to the top. So really, unfortunately, it often takes a true crisis to get people's attention. But I think, personally, I think the tax code is a true crisis here, and that is something probably that could be the number one issue to get people kind of galvanized and moving forward. So my question is, how do we get from the land of the fourth quintile to the land of 10,000 opportunities a day? And so I kind of divided it into like a short-term and a long-term perspective. So short-term, I think, identify the crises. I mean, it helps if people really, truly see these problems as crises and not just kind of minor annoyances. And also take on just a few issues at a time. I mean, it's hard to get people to focus on more than maybe one or two things at a time if you're going to try to make comprehensive reform. So it's important to pick your battles right, pick the issues that are most, I think, most in people's attention and mind, and they can actually feel the problem, see the problem, have relatives and family members that have been affected by it. And also, really important to defend past successes. So when you do succeed, make sure that you have an infrastructure set up to support it going forward. I mean, there are no permanent victories in politics. So I can give you two examples from California. Two organizations that all they do full-time is defend two pieces of legislation. And one is the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, which was set up to defend Prop 13, which was passed in 1978, which is the property tax limitations in California. And so this one group, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, Sacramento, all they do is defend this proposition, and they've done it successfully since 1978. And the other one is CAP. It's called CAP, Californians Align for Patient Protection. But it was set up explicitly just to defend the MICRA, or the medical malpractice liability reforms that were passed in 1975, signed by Jerry Brown, of all people. We were talking about Jerry earlier, who's probably going to run for governor again next year. But Jerry Brown signed the legislation in 1975, and this group was set up just to defend it, and has done so successfully. And actually, California is the model for the rest of the country in terms of the right way to structure a medical malpractice reform legislation. So, and it's worked well. So that's the one thing I think is almost more important than passing new reforms is to defend what you've already done. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels. Next is, identify key allies. It's political judicial constellation matters. It's a political battle as well as a policy battle. I mean, you can have all the 30th rankings and all the quintiles and all the facts on your side, but you still need to have the judicial and the legislative branch align correctly to make some significant changes. So you have to always constantly keep that in mind too. Politics does matter, but it helps to have the ammunition on your side. And people need to know, as I mentioned earlier, that they can do something about it. They need to understand the connection between policy reforms and the policy outcomes, or the performance outcomes in terms of GDP growth, unemployment reduction, that sort of thing. So they need to understand that connection. And also, you have to get the message out. I heard Newt Gingrich speak a couple weeks ago, and he was saying that our side spends way too much on creating content, which I took offense at, because that's what I do. I create content. But I think he's right, that we spend too much time creating content like this and too little time on getting the message out and coming up with new creative ways to get the message to people that need to understand it and to activate, energize the public. And I think he's right, that our side, I think, has done a kind of has a limited perspective on how to do that. He mentioned how well the Obama campaign did in terms of sometimes you have to give a little less control over the message in terms of what's said, and let people kind of craft their own version of the message and get it out, because people were texting things and emailing things, and it wasn't always controlled and contained like McCain administration or campaign tried to do, but it was more successful in terms of energizing the public. So I think that's an important message, is try to think of new ways to reach people. The other one is, have strategies ready to defeat opponents. We're always going to criticize the proposals on equity and fairness grounds. It generally always comes down eventually to an equity fairness argument. I think particularly in Minnesota, where people think more in those terms than a lot of other states. So I think that's important to always have, your ducks in a row and ready to have the facts that are necessary to defeat the equity arguments that would be used against it. Because generally, they're not supported by actual data. In long term, I think, again, getting back to the Minnesota Free Market Institute, it's important to have a sustained educational campaign long term to change people's opinions about how government works, how policy works, what are the upsides of government, what's the downsides of government, kind of the whole public choice aspect of looking at government, which is what I come from at George Mason. So, again, it's important to come up with a long-term strategy of education and effective, kind of innovative ways to communicate the message. Now, next is, let's see. So why does it matter? Why does it matter if we make these changes and improve Minnesota's ranking and overall performance? And that gets to the last study that was mentioned, a new one that I did with Bob Murphy, who some of you might know, an Austrian economist, and now works for us at the Pacific Research Institute. But the Sizzle of economic freedom. So first off, what is economic freedom? In a nutshell, it's the right of an individual to own what he earns and to choose how to spend the income that he earns. It's the right to produce what he wants in accordance with his own values. And lastly, the right to compete in product and labor markets of his choosing. So these are kind of like the fundamental rights or aspects of economic freedom, with, of course, the one caveat that you cannot use force or fraud to further your own ends. So that's the working definition that we use when we create the U.S. Economic Freedom Index and ranks the states according to economic freedom. This is our working definition of economic freedom. And then we wanted to look at, in this study, what are the benefits? Besides just, freedom is a benefit in its own right, but what else, what are the secondary benefits that accrue to societies or individuals because of greater economic freedom? So after we're looking at all of the extensive, expansive academic literature on it, much more too than we ever thought was out there. We were both shocked in terms of how much has actually been done looking at the benefits of greater economic freedom both at the state and, of course, at the national level. So in terms of, I'll just kind of rapidly list them all here, but higher personal income, that's my shorthand notation, but for example, a 10% increase in economic freedom for a state leads to upwards of, it's between 7 and 14%, so 14% top increase in personal income. So more economic freedom means more personal income. That's one message that I think is important that every Minnesotan needs to understand, and you can't hit it too much. The other one is less unemployment, for example, and that's a huge issue now, and a great message to hit on is, for example, states that don't index their minimum wage, last year in 2008, had a 25% lower rate of increase in their unemployment rate. So indexing of the minimum wage, which translates into less economic freedom, means more unemployment. So that's another area. Faster economic growth, more macroeconomic stability. We've seen the results of interventions by government at the national level in terms of the disruption in the housing market, the financial markets. Another perfect example of what happens when you get too much rigging of prices by the federal government. More macroeconomic stability, greater capital investment and productivity, more business startups. I put in red the ones that relate to the big four performance areas. More business startups, so we see more entrepreneurship in states that have more economic freedom. One of the arguments too that is made often, we need more state involvement at the venture capital level. We need more government programs to subsidize entrepreneurs, to start programs to help nurture entrepreneurs. But the research actually shows that's not true. For example, this study, there's a couple studies actually that we talk about in here that show that if you increase economic freedom, you get more entrepreneurial activity, which leads to more venture capital. It's not the other way around. You don't need the VC first. In other words, if you build it, they will come. If you have good entrepreneurs, good landscape, low regulations, low taxes, that encourages entrepreneurs to come to your area, that in itself will entice venture capitalists to invest in that area. You don't need to prime the pump with state programs that pick and choose winners. All you need to do is kind of create a general rules of the game that's fair for everybody, that encourages entrepreneurs to come in. And so that's an important lesson. Another one is, better educated workforce. School choice is kind of the aspect of economic freedom that relates to education. Vouchers, that sort of thing. Less poverty and inequality, which I think is probably an important message for Minnesota, because I think the tax proposals that are being talked about will probably tie into, well, how does it impact the poor? How does it impact the income distribution over time and that sort of thing? Well, the results are, with more economic freedom, you actually see a leveling of playing field, less poverty, more economic growth, and less inequality over time, not more. Better health overall, and this is another one that's relevant to Minnesota. As we mentioned earlier, you have a net outflow of people from the state, but it turns out the more economically free your state is, the more that you attract people to your state. So I looked at the top 20 states in terms of their economic freedom, and there's a plus 27 people per 1,000 are moving into the state. And if you look at the bottom 20 states in terms of economic freedom, the only plus 1 person per 1,000 is moving into the state. So in other words, people are fleeing the more economically oppressed states and moving to the more economically free states. And what's interesting about that is there's also political implications of it, because they're going to take their electoral college votes with them as they move. They're going to take their, so it's going to impact the next census. The new projections are that California is actually going to lose 1 congressman in 2010 after the next census, because of the mass exodus from California, driven in large part by the poor economy and the poor opportunities there. So keep that in mind too, that Minnesota is not only losing people, but they could lose political influence as well as more and more people leave the state. The other one is cleaner environment, which is important here. The line is, the affluent society doesn't want to be the effluent society. As you get wealthier, you put more money into, and you have more resources to actually keep your environment cleaner. I mean, we've seen that. Look at the old Eastern European bloc, and this makes that case starkly evident. And overall, better quality of life. So, what is so in other words, I mean, economic freedom really does pay off in terms of the benefits it gives to everybody in their daily life. Now, is there like a good blueprint that Minnesota can follow? And I think there is. I think a good country to focus on would be Ireland. They had just this vast, stark, quick turnaround in that country by focusing on just a few simple reforms, primarily their tax code. And in a very short time, I mean, they turned themselves around. They went from kind of being this slow growth, middle-tier European country to being basically the Silicon Valley of Europe. And they did it very quickly. And as you can see, I mean, they don't have that many people, 4.2 million people, and they created about $285 billion worth of output in the last measurement, whereas Minnesota, 5.2 million, and you actually produce more, or less output. So you have more people, but you're producing less here than they are in Ireland. So I think it's a great example. There's been a lot written on it. If you Google, Ben Powell has written a lot on, they call it like the Irish miracle, how through just a few simple policy reforms, it really radically changed the country. And I think there's a lot of similarities between Minnesota and Ireland, actually. I mean, kind of the population size comes to mind, but I mean, it's a very educated workforce, kind of family-oriented. The weather isn't that great in either place, but it shows that you really can turn it into a dynamic, innovative, creative economy of the future by just focusing on a few major policy reforms. So, I mean, I think Minnesota has a lot of potential, but as Darryl Royal said, potential just means you ain't done it yet. So, I mean, there's more work to be done, and I think, though, that it's kind of evident where the work needs to be done if you kind of look at Minnesota and compare it to the other states. And I think, so this kind of gives you a good blueprint of where you need to go. It's just a matter of energizing the public, because it's not going to happen until the public really wants it to happen, and you get the message out and you can convince people to make it happen. Thank you.